Welcome to the conformance sub-project meeting of SIG Architecture. Depending where you are in the world, it could be Wednesday, the 12th of August, or Tuesday, the 11th of August. We have a full agenda, and we are getting recorded, so please follow our code of conduct, which be kind would be a good summary of that. We have on our discussion today a couple of points. I put a few at the top just in case the third one goes really long, and the rest, if we don't get to them, I'm okay pushing them off to the next time we meet. The first one is improving vendor CNCF member participation and improving conformance coverage. Somebody added that, but they didn't add who that was. So if they are here, I would love to yield the floor.
I don't know if it's entirely appropriate for us to have this discussion. This was sort of in advance of suggesting that it's an issue the steering committee discussed with Priyanka, but for all the folks who are here, there is concern amongst those of us on the steering committee and those of us in SIG Architecture that the number of vendors contributing to improving conformance test coverage is 1. And we feel like compared to the number of vendors that have their offerings certified as compliant or conformant for Kubernetes, that's a bit of a mismatch. And so, I could see it as if I were somebody who wasn't the one vendor working on implementing conformance coverage, I could be concerned that, coverage might head in a direction that excludes my offering. And it might be of some benefit to me to participate in hammering out coverage upstream so that we can sort of help identify those issues sooner. But I think, Priyanka was interested in having us kind of brainstorm, how do those of us who benefit from this program, how can we align incentives such that there's more people contributing here than a single vendor and II. And this is in no way meant to disparage the work that II is doing. In fact, really, if Hibby and his team were not contributing to conformance test coverage, we'd be significantly further behind than we are today. They've done tremendous work for us, which has been great. And I don't know, maybe you could argue like, oh, well, vendors are pitching in that way because some of their dues that they're contributing to the CNCF are helping pay this team of contractors to work on coverage. And like, that's understandable, but I still feel like we could have more people writing more tests. So something to think about. I don't know how much time we want to spend talking about this.
So earlier we used to have a monthly CNCF run conformance meeting too, right? I mean, that was a non-coding side of things where they used to discuss, or doesn't look like we are having those anymore. It's probably a good platform to attract vendors.
So that could be useful. I will just sort of quote your description and say there wasn't a lot of coding happening there. So it's not entirely clear to me how that's gonna help drive that forward. But like I could see, if we decide we really need to dig into profiles in depth and we feel like we're not getting the correct audience here, that maybe we look at discussing it there. But this really is like, if you care about how the CNCF sort of in that meeting, we decided that it was up to the Kubernetes project to define what conformance is, like what it means. It's up to the CNCF to own the process that puts the stamp of approval on that, but it's ultimately up to the Kubernetes project to define conformance. And so if you benefit from the Kubernetes project and you benefit from conformance, ostensibly you benefit from showing up here. But again, I realize I'm kind of talking all stick, no carrot here. I'm not really great at brainstorming and being super creative about this. So it's something to consider.
Thank you for that, Aaron. I want to give it just a moment for anybody that wants to submit via the chat or to speak up real quick. We did have that conformance working group meeting, and there would be a lot of discussion, but I don't know that we came to a lot of actionable processes. Once we defined, we just had a severe lack in coverage, and most of our time it felt best to spend on actually just getting those tests written and improving the coverage. As these discussions, I think as Aaron was noting, are leaning more towards what does it look like to define conformance. Is this the space for that in this conformance Kubernetes meeting? Because we usually use this for PR reviews and for helping to define the tests that we need to write. We often haven't needed to have a lot of space for defining our profiles. We've gone through a couple different iterations of that, and I want to make sure that. Sorry, we're kind of confusing topics. The CNCF member participation. I think that other call, if we spin that up, might also be another place to discuss the
yeah,
profiles.
I think this is more a technical discussion here on how to build tests and improve the coverage, right? But then the engagement part, it was probably a better idea earlier, and I don't know why we canceled those, but that would probably engage more of the vendor side of things, so, which then we get the feedback on what is good, what is not good that we are doing. That's the only.
I think Walter made a great point in chat that pushing this via SIGs is probably one approach to take. So those vendors who participate in SIGs would be able to contribute that way. Yeah, I could definitely see us heading in that direction. I think, Hippie's team has sort of been really solidifying their tooling. And so we could get to the point where we use that to provide guidance. I also feel like the usual, so we've done a good job of making sure that we don't like make the situation worse going forward. Anybody who wants to promote their feature to GA has to have conformance tests for it. So I think we've done good in that regard, as some of Hippie's reporting can show. But as far as retroactive coverage, that's a really good question. And I know that there are a number of folks within the project who are kind of talking about maybe really focusing on our testing for the next couple of months as we look to improve just the overall reliability and stability and coverage of our testing. So it may be that we decide to improve the reliability of Kubernetes. We're going to say that SIGs make improved conformance testing coverage a priority. There's been discussion of things like not allowing any new feature work to land until we feel like SIGs have done their due diligence. Which again, sounds like all stick, no carrot, but I think mobilizes potentially more of the project's contributors. So it's a really good point, Walter.
Aaron, I have a question. This is Vladimir.
Yeah.
So based on what you just described, which is other efforts going on to make sure that SIGs define whatever their compliance is prior to having some feature being moving forward, what else do you see is needed to enlarge the volume of test coverage?
I think what I threw out there was just sort of an idea off the top of my head, and we still sort of need more discussion and consensus around whether that's the direction we want to head, and then like how we would measure that work and divvy it up. I don't know if that really answers your question though. What more beyond that? I mean, the ideal outcome is the number of tests that are written and then ultimately promoted to conformance that come from authors other than the II team grows. Like that's the successful metric.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense now. So basically going beyond just this core team and have more participation in creating coverage if you're an author of a feature somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely had this, I would say a lot of the discussion here from the strategic level has centered around like, so what is the most important thing to cover first, given the limited set of resources that we have available to us. And I feel like we've done a pretty good job of that, but it would be cool if more resources were available so we could accomplish more rather than continuing to operate in an extremely constrained mode. So I think this is, still probably a great place to kind of decide what's appropriate. Yeah. Have we tried to engage workload authors? Not to my knowledge. That also sounds like a good idea. It's sort of the situation where I feel like our end-to-end tests are not the most user-friendly thing to experience. I know, again, he and his team have been making a lot of progress on building up knowledge and how to educate others in that process. And so that could be something that we leverage.
Part of my thought is also that if we have workload authors who want their workloads to work anywhere, be it, operator, tools or anything else where they're trying to sell their workload or just generally have it work anywhere, then they have a lot to gain by trying to make sure the conformance tests cover all of the API surface that they use.
Yeah, I completely agree.
One of the approaches we've used in helping to make sure that our mock test or the attempts before we write a test that make our coverage is we deploy API Snoop as a audit sync and inject that into a database to allow us to see what our EDE binary is hitting. But it could just as easily be used on an existing cluster to see what a particular workload is hitting. So for this isolated workload, when you select all of the components and part of that from a very discrete level, not only which APIs you're hitting, but the specific way you're hitting it from an analysis point of view, rather than kind of going through the code level review. I'm not sure if that would be useful for our workload authors or not.
And Aaron, you mentioned the state of the test API. Do you think that if it gets easier for folks to write this, we would see more participation?
It may be possible. Yeah, I feel like if there was, it's the law of open source, right? The less friction there is, the more likely you are to pick up contribution.
Right.
So I'd say there's a decent amount of friction involved in writing end-to-end tests. I've been tangentially involved in the testing commons subproject of SIG testing to try and either like break up the E2E framework or maybe reorganize it or maybe look at using something else entirely. But it's not something that I personally have been able to allocate a lot of my bandwidth or a lot of my team's bandwidth to. I feel like there are some folks from VMware who are helping out there, but it also seems to be kind of a bandwidth constrained thing. So I think like if somebody had a testing framework that they really liked, it could make people's lives a lot better.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. Anyway, I feel like we've been talking about this for about 20 minutes. There's a bunch of other stuff on the agenda. I didn't want to take up too much of everybody's time if Priyanka's not around. So thanks. I appreciate the time.
Thanks for your time on that, everyone. I wanted to put this topic at the top real quick because it'll be really quick and I can hopefully get it merged. We're trying to reduce our denominator for the number of things we need to hit. And 21 of our open API endpoints in the proxy area will be absolutely unable to be reached. And this is because within the code, there's a 301 move permanent redirect. You can see here via our curl when we go in and hit anything for a pod space proxy without any slashes, it just gets a permanent redirect. And that is located in the code. I think there's actually the link somewhere to that. So we were going to
the links at the very top.
The links at the very top. Thanks for that. So there's the 302 redirect. So just a quick look at the underlying code. If it's missing any part of the query path, it just goes ahead and appends that slash and puts the query part on there, so you can't hit those endpoints. I'll drop this in the chat real quick, but my suggestion here is that we remove these from availability for conformance because no one will ever be able to hit them. Any questions or discussion on that?
Wait, I'm confused. Why can't people test them? Like, maybe I just don't understand. I think I missed
totally. This code right here, I'll make it real big. On incoming HTTP request, if there is a link to it, like a query part, it will rewrite the header and add the slash, and then give a 302 redirect for where it wants you to go. We will never be able to query those endpoints because the API machinery proxy doesn't allow you to hit them.
Maybe I misunderstood. So you're saying we just don't test this particular URL query? Like proxy works, proxy should be part of conformance. Maybe I think, I'm sorry.
Sure, sorry, pardon me. Stephen, you had done a lot of research in this. Do you want to speak really quick to the total number of proxy endpoints that are available versus the ones that you were able to hit?
There's 39 in total. If you scroll further down the document, there is the links to the actual API documentation. So there's proxy with path is what it's the API endpoint that it gets redirected to, and that's what is actually getting used.
Okay. Proxy without path is not possible. Okay. Sorry, I did not understand. Yeah, that's totally reasonable to say due to the design of the system, you do not have to implement the operation proxy without path because it is impossible to invoke. Now, I guess we could say we do require you to do a redirect, which seems reasonable because that's what a Kube API server does today. So Aaron, I see Aaron nodding. So I would be totally fine saying the conformance definition of that operation is it will give you a move permanently to slash.
Lovely. That is a really clear, and I'm glad you're on the call.
Although it's funny because now that you mentioned that, I'm like terrified because I vaguely remember this issue and I like, oh, I was going to come back to this like 5 years ago and then forgot. So now this is bubbled back up and I'm going to go see something horrifying that's going to make me sad. So, thank you.
That sounds
We
great.
are.
Yeah.
So,
It was an original issue with Grafana breaking without the slash.
I will cast no aspersions on anyone in the community, but this is some deeply terrifying, horrifying code that Dan put in and is not Dan's fault. It was so early in Cube that we didn't know what we were doing. So nobody blame Dan, but it's his fault.
Yay for a long family history in our community, and I look forward to ensuring that everybody in the world, when they have Kubernetes, will do a 301 redirect. So that's that one, and then I think this is one that's going to get a lot of discussion here. So I'm going to go ahead and close all my other windows so that it's just down to here. This is our thoughts on conformance. On our last meeting, Bellamar, John, had said, I'm going to put together a document. Thanks, Clayton, for that. Make one mistake, support it forever. Here's our Bellamark's thoughts on our conformance profiles. And we had the initial idea back in 2017 from Willie. Good to see you on the call. And there wasn't much progress on that because we're just trying to get some tests, some set of coverage. So we have this profiles kept that we got through in the provisional status. And I'm not sure if I should try to walk through this together or what's the best way to generate discussion. Because I think is there any conversation you want to have on the purpose of profiles as we go through these 3 paragraphs?
Well, I mean, just the history. I don't know if the history, as we all agreed to it in 2017. I think there was if my memory serves correct, there was a huge focus on, well, we could talk a lot about profiles, but I think it was folks like Aaron that said, and Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, hey, we've got a lot of areas where we got to build up just tests that we don't need to put in a conformance profile that would just go into the base. And until we get the base really flushed out, we're probably okay deferring the discussion on profiles. I mean, that was my recollection, Aaron. Let me know if yours was different. But that's what I remember hearing you say a lot. And I think the interesting thing was, you know, waiting for the point, a hippie hacker, for when somebody shows up with a test or a group of tests and they, for some reason, feel like we can't put it in the base, right? So have we had the person show up that said, I've got a group of tests and half the vendors are freaking out about my tests. We've done the diligence and I can't get, say, above 50% of the distros wanting to put this in the base. And oh my goodness, if I can't get, you know, if I'm only at about 50%, you know, maybe there's the cloud provider version, maybe there's the lighter version of Kubernetes, and we've got a partition between our wonderful community. Maybe we ought to think about a profile. So I think we were always waiting to be stakeholder driven, that somebody would show up with a test or a group of tests that didn't feel like they could just go through the normal process of, you know, being promoted to conformance. Because if all you have is tests showing up that well, everybody seems to like, well, they can just keep doing what they're doing and putting them in the base. So I think that's what, you know, was the thought exercise that I think John put together here, is him thinking about what somebody may potentially show up with as a type of test that maybe is worthy of a profile. But the question is, do we have anybody in the practical sense that is knocking on Aaron's doorstep or knocking on your doorstep saying, these group of tests need to be part of conformance, but yet we've got a high level of thought that maybe only half the the distros are going to be willing to accept that. Does that make any sense?
It does. I feel like I see William unmuted, but I'll just say a few words since he mentioned me. Just to be clear about my position was that I cared about core conformance coverage, and I didn't particularly, I mean, if y'all wanted to continue to discuss profiles, that's fine, but that didn't seem to help move the ball forward on core coverage. And so I think we're at, like, I did just make a plea that we could use more help making core coverage. Don't get me wrong, there's more to do, but an example of a user banging on my door would probably be anybody who wants to run a stateful workload can't actually verify or validate that their stateful workload will run on any Kubernetes cluster according to the CNCF, because we have no way of testing out storage in a binding way, right? So I think storage is one of those profiles that makes a lot of sense to me. But I think, you know, there's also been discuss. Again, I think sort of from the user perspective, I think there are a number of offerings out there that are slightly more restricted from a security perspective about what they allow users to do with the cluster. And it would really be great if we could like validate and say with confidence that yes, user, your workload will work on this cluster. But we can't do that today because some of the conformance tests, you know, exercise a lot more privilege than an end user or, you know, an application operator might actually exercise against their cluster. So I feel like this continues to be driven sort of from the user perspective. So that's just how I'm approaching it.
I don't have a whole lot to add there other than, I guess, you know, it does feel like a lot has matured and sort of changed in the last 3 years. And as you said, Aaron, there are some more restricted offerings out there. So maybe there's a good user angle to say, you know, to be able to test a workload and know that it's going to be able to run everywhere. For example, if it doesn't need certain privilege access.
So it's kind of interesting that you brought that up, Aaron, because like I think we were waiting for someone. So it's kind of the if you think that nobody cares that you exist, try missing a mortgage payment. I think I have to say that there's been times where I've been tempted to say we should put something in as a test of the emergency broadcast system of conformance and see who fails on one of these dimensions, just from the perspective of like as an experiment, but that would create a bunch of churn that we could do more productively. The stateful is actually a great question. I know lots of Kubernetes deployments that have no persistent volumes. And so I think it's like the two things that we've talked so far both seem reasonable. We were always waiting for something else to show up. Nothing else ever did. And we've very carefully tried not to rock the boat. I think these are the two most reasonable things that anyone has articulated in 5 years that is a meaningful improvement for users, that benefits people. And at worst, we will be like, okay, like we're doing this with this intent. Oh, we suddenly caused a whole bunch of people to become non-conformant. Let's stop and take their feedback and iterate. And as long as we have that, I think if this is the most disruptive thing we do with conformance in 6 years or 5 years, I think that's okay. And I don't expect it to be that bad.
Right. So it's the one I heard for sure was the storage ones, right? Because not everybody has storage. What was the other one that we thought might break the smaller folks? The other folks?
The privilege thing does not, because the privilege thing is actually a restriction down to something that is more useful, because we have privileged in-base conformance today. And I'd be happy to sign OpenShift up for the, like, we can take out the thing that makes the test process root on production clusters in order to be able to run that test, and be a great step. I haven't heard someone articulate another one yet, except possibly the, like exec is not allowed on a lot of production clusters, and we allow that to be disabled. and exec actually is one of the most useful tools. So that's almost an anti-user one, where technically it would be better if it were required, but the security concerns are, a whole history of you don't allow people to access running
Sure.
systems unless they're FIPS compliant, blah blah blah, crazy stuff.
There.
So I could see that being disruptive in the reverse direction, which is the reality is people do not support these.
Right. So taking your storage example, what would be interesting is if there was a proposal to move, some of the storage tests in, it would be very curious to see what is the percentage of the distros out there that break. So is it 5%? Is it 20%? Is it 50%? Because that helps you to define, where you're at. Is it, well, can some of that group level up and eventually say they can support it? Or is there a smaller subset that just says, we can't do that? Because it may not be the worst thing in the world. What it sounds like is maybe there's just two profiles. There's the more fully functional one that can handle storage. And then maybe and when you call that a fancy name, and we could pick the fancier name that from a marketing perspective, whether it's cloud provider level or enterprise level or whatever is the appropriate name that is very inclusive. And it'll be very curious to see, if you break it into those two profiles, the one with storage, the one without, and then what is the percentage of the number of distros that fit into it? Is it 80-20? Can 80% handle storage and 20% can't? That'll help you get a good feel, I think, for, the interoperability and the confusion that's going to occur by now having two profiles instead of one. It helps us to get our hands around, how big a complexity this is by trying to embrace those new storage into the conformance, Clayton.
So one option would be, certainly within this group's, remit to reduce the scope of conformance. I don't think it's unreasonable potentially for us in a major release to slim down the scope of what is officially conformance to a subset base, keep the extra ones in there and report something in a non-judgmental way, which gives people a time and a process, and then set a timeline for feedback based on that over a couple of weeks. I assume this is in some of the proposals, so I haven't reread it in a while, but I don't think a vendor could argue that, we want to make people aware of it, and the best way to make people aware of it is to surface it the next time they recertify in an informational capacity, and then engage them directly and get a measure of engagement. For instance, if we added, and maybe it's not just one, we could do something more specific, I can think maybe of one other example, which is more of an infrastructure one, which is, I know platforms don't allow people to create namespaces, because if you can create namespaces, you can bypass any specific protections people put. So there's another factor there of, we don't have the infrastructure to do that in the current test framework, and people just grant access. The set of considerations, if we had those options and we reported them, we could pick 1, 2, 3, 4 smaller groups, simply flag them and say, these are being considered for inclusion in a more advanced profile. Please include whether you pass, in a way that we can just mechanically gather the data without causing extra work for CNCF submitters.
And it's really cool that you mentioned that, Clayton, because that process you talked about, the process of getting people to level up and figure out what the issues are, I think that's been our big concern, is that process has always been the piece that's never been sort of written down. I think if you go look at John's proposal, I do not think that process is in there. And I think that's the linchpin. That's the key thing that makes this work. Because that goes back to the spirit of March 2017, because we were all in the room in Austin. That's exactly what we were doing. Let's go look at these tests and go run them. And let's go see how many each distro passed. So I think you're getting us back to the spirit, Clayton, of what we wanted to do many years ago. And that's really, really cool.
But with Aaron's caveat that people are going to actually need to do something. And so maybe that's so Aaron, this might actually be a good opportunity to both have a little bit of a carrot and a little bit of the stick. And this would actually be a fairly significant event with which to create a desire to engage. if we can, couple those together, and, or certainly this could be in service to your other goal as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I kind of, whatever. I always figured when profiles got serious, vendors would come back to the table. So, yeah, I don't know, Brad. Huh?
Maybe they don't, and then that's a data point that we can use.
Yeah, that's true too. So I hear your point, Brad, about like concern over fragmentation. I share that concern deeply, but I also don't necessarily know whether or not we should be beholden to the momentum of what's there. I definitely so for this, the storage example is certainly more complicated, which is why I think that when we were talking about this originally, we were talking about the base and privileged example. It seemed like it was pretty much a no-brainer. It seemed like there was consensus on that. And like the reason we're here talking about it now is because it wasn't quite as straightforward as we anticipated. And so I think like rather than dig into the logistics of exactly how the crank would be turned, with that concern of fragmentation in mind, it's important for us to think about what is the appropriate shape and scope of profiles so that they do make the most sense. And so we don't have, overly stratified, overly fragmented things that serve nobody. So I think I made up some examples off the top of my head. I sort of trust like Clayton and John's judgment a lot more when it comes to other ways we could frame this or think about this further down in the document. I just wanted to make sure we weren't talking about the first 3 paragraphs the whole time.
Yeah. But what's interesting is, like Clayton said, we've had this topic for, say, 5 years, and after 5 years of study and opportunity for investigation, he's come up with 2. So, the concern of we're going to end up with 12 profiles and everything's going to be a crazy nightmare, let's call that, the Brad paranoia, maybe is unfounded, right? Maybe that's unfounded if we're really, after 5 years, we're kind of down to storage and base versus privilege.
As someone who has seen, and I say this in a non-judgmental, loving way, I have seen other people's dirty laundry, and I've seen where the bodies are buried in some Cube implementations, and vendors who are trying to work with multiple ones. Most people that I've seen, even very responsible engineering teams, they're just struggling to get by because Cube's got enough problems. They got 99 problems and conformance ain't one. We have improved our core suite. We've improved the conformance suite in the last 4 years. Jordan did highlight in that last SIG Arch some of the areas where we're still weak. Like we had a good effort at upgrade. We use the upgrade tests and we have added others, but like some of them are very specific to the distro, which is kind of like a weird nuance, but like it's important that this stuff is available during rolling upgrade. Like the fact that service proxies with load balancers and local endpoint policy don't actually offer graceful draining and termination is something that we should have caught in Cube a long time ago, because it's kind of embarrassing that you can't actually run an HA app through service load balancers and use the service traffic local policy to get, like, these are things that we've learned. We have a vehicle to put the tests in, but we don't have any vehicle to drive it out. And if we can come up with a process that works on the first profile, maybe profiles isn't the right, maybe they're like little bumps on the growing conformance suite, and it's just a bunch of checkboxes. And maybe it serves as, we spend most of our time adding checkboxes that people are not passing, and everybody kind of takes a couple of releases to get up to speed. That would be just as good of an outcome, because the end result here is we want people to have the capacity to change, to improve conformance, to improve the state of their systems. I think a lot of people don't know what tests they aren't passing because they get conformance running and then they don't get anything else running. And that, I guess that's I don't want that to seem like an aspersion. There is a lot of stuff to go make work in Cube that regular tests don't cover. So there's also that factor. I don't think there's anything that, I think it's the right time basically to start adding the bumps on the profile and start growing it in that dimension.
Right, and the only request is for those bumps was if by chance really the bump could be something that feels like it fits in the base, we'll just add it to the base. Don't make it a new profile. That was right, because it sounded like the ones that you just described were ones, say, not like storage, where not everybody has storage, persistent storage, but it sounded like that the one you described was just a level up one that in your mind, Clayton, you thought, well, I'm pretty sure it's just a matter of time, but everybody should be able to add these. It's just the time frame to give them time to do it. Did I misinterpret that or no?
No, I think, and that plenty of the things I've seen, like there are things that, you know, for instance, Tim in the early days of Cube obsessed very deeply over things with service proxies and behaviors. Those are actually inconsistent between CNI plugins. I'm not saying our job is to go solve CNI plugins, but for instance, you get different behavior within a pod if you curl an endpoint and it has 0 endpoints versus 1, depending on what your CNI provider is and the guarantees they've offered. And to an application, that means that your application fails differently depending on your CNI vendor. I don't know that I would go so far as to say we have to force everybody, but even knowing that, this is a way that we can spread some of that knowledge. And if people are failing their deployments, you know, if people are not getting a green checkbox on the entirely optional new safe zone areas that they have time to address, that's a good step in the right direction of making Cube better.
Right. Yeah, and so if you have it framed as we're going to do our best to try and put this in the base as opposed to taking the easy way out and just calling it a new profile, I think that's where you do the community of service, because my fear has always been they just want to, well, let's kick the tires on profiles, let's go make it a profile. But if it's sort of right of first refusal that, well, let's really see if we can get those optional checkboxes on a roadmap to get into the base, I think you keep the cats herded a little bit better.
Or we just run all the profiles,
yeah,
and we check what the failure conditions are.
Yep.
And even failing a profile is part of the base.
Yep.
Something like
That's
that. At the end of the day, if we don't run it, it won't get run. And if we don't give people a reason to run it and a benefit, they won't run it.
Yeah.
I think, you know,
But
it
that's
doesn't
the
sound
right
like
process.
a real disagreement from the desire to move forward in a practical fashion, though.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you've got the right process, which is really cool.
We recently added some automation to the CNCF Kate's conformance repo that compares the list of tests that they should be running to the tests that they actually do run, and give feedback. And here are the tests that you were missing and the steps that you weren't following. If we were to do something similar for our profiles to say similar feedback, I think that would fit in line with what I'm hearing.
So it sounds like we all agree on the process essentially, right? And
Well,
trying to get to move forward, no?
My caveat is I feel like the author of the doc is in here, and I don't know whether or not I am accurately representing the contents of the doc. So I think like this is intended to kick off the discussion for sure, but
Sure.
I really think we should have a more thorough discussion in the doc.
Yeah. John will be listening to this, so
Yeah.
John,
Yeah.
we're coming for you, and know that we love you and that we want to give feedback. And we certainly have enough to say there's no disagreement within this group. One of the things I think we should probably do is do what we can to get that wrinkle, like the vendor knee-jerk reaction, I think is a key design constraint we should explicitly design around in the proposal of what we do. And we don't want to create a mess for CNCF to clean up. So whatever we do probably should have that assumption baked in. And I think, you know, is the obvious thing to do. So it's not novel for me to say that. Just that's the factor that to mitigate the original fear of profiles is you will not fail conformance or trademark at a critical boundary in the first release or the second release or within whatever window we think is reasonable. But we are looking at these for inclusion into the larger conformance suite in order to drive value for end users. And if this doesn't meet your needs, please attend the conformance definition meetings. And
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, the original proposal for profiles was to split split the existing conformance thing into base and privilege, the idea would be that like, all right, let's assume that that actually worked. The idea is like anybody who passes conformance today is still conformant plus a privilege profile. So we didn't view it as like having any negative impact retroactively. And that's why it seemed to make more sense starting there versus an additive profile.
I only bring that up just in the sense of, I know that people won't run the additional profiles. And since we're lacking the data about whether people actually are going to pass, fail, or care, whatever process we pick should, in as trivial a manner as possible, because not everybody uses Sonobui. And so we should just come up with a reasonable process that has the warm fuzzy for everybody else, whether it's additive or not.
Yeah, I agree. I will go back and revisit the conformance profiles implementation doc I proposed, because one of the options that admittedly didn't seem to get a whole lot of traction was like, yeah, just run them all and then like figure out what, you know, what profiles you fit at the end. And the feedback I got back was sort of felt like that's really not intuitive to me as a developer. If I'm trying to like get my thing up to implementation, I want to see the test pass and know that I'm done. I don't want to have to keep seeing a bunch of tests pass and fail and then have to figure out what that means. But I agree, there's value in like, if we can make that as seamless process as possible, I think it would be useful to have that extra data to know that like, you know, you're really close to this.
Could we define, like this is maybe a variation on that idea, but it's just, can we define the tests as having a certain behavior if you don't have a key gating criteria? And because like we do, like, don't get me started on Ginkgo. I don't want to talk about Ginkgo right now. Yeah. But for the purposes of like, I'm a little nervous about skipping tests in precondition checking. But for instance, you know, if there was a way to invoke the tests so that some skips became, or some failures became skips, that might be the best outcome, which is when the thing runs in a conformance mode or whatever. Like, I don't like, maybe I step back. I kind of, maybe one of the things that we do is we don't really treat tests like an artifact. It's an amalgamation of stuff. A place where a vendor might be able to create value is looking at more coherent ways of us representing the test or the suite of tests. That could be Sonobui, I think that's fine. But like whatever mechanism that is, if that is really gonna be the official way, it really does need to move under the responsibility. Some of that could be something a vendor could pick up or help with. I'm just worried because like we have continually turned the crank on complexity of the Ginkgo stack. And I didn't want to get into it. I was thinking about like all of the ways that all of the things we do are going to add complexity and make it more error prone. Yeah.
Yeah, I hear everything. I've been down that road. I'm trying not to necessarily, because I feel like there's sort of the semantic question of profiles that's independent from the technical implementation. But if there were some things we could simplify about the technical implementation, it would be really great for everybody. And, you know, depending on where we're at timeline wise, I am talking to the author of Ginkgo about Ginkgo 2 and what features in Ginkgo 2 might be really, really useful for one of the larger users of it.
I made the mistake of caring too much about this, and we have like a whole shim around it that offers a nice experience, and I still regret it. So okay. I don't want to advocate for that, but yeah, some sort of movement around like, we don't have formal suite definitions. Like, what could we say as requirements or next to haves that could give vendors room to participate, for instance?
Yes. So maybe this goes back to Vlad's question earlier about like the testing commons subproject and making it easier to write end-to-end tests in the first place. I appreciate what a large effort that could end up being, making sure that we can sort of bridge between the old and the new. And so I'd like to make sure that I anticipate this this is a continuing series of discussions around the semantics of profiles. And I think it's wise that we continue to have those discussions independent of the, technically how it's all implemented. But these can certainly help shape the requirements of what we want the technical implementation to accomplish. And the other piece I was just going to toss in there is that, I do think Hippie and his team have been working to help kind of automate away some of the checking of things on behalf of the CNCF. So we're not just looking to see was the number of tests that passed 273, but actually was it this exact set of tests with all of these test names that passed? And we could probably then maybe loosen our constraints on what tests are and are not allowed to skip to help with the implementation of optional profiles and stuff like that. So I feel like we have the pieces in place to step forward. It's just making sure we kind of get agreement on the best path forward. Yeah, those things. You're muted right now.
I just dropped a link to our CNCF infra prow config, which is the prow.cncf.io setup that goes against Kate's CNCF, Kate's conformance eventually. And this is where we could add some extra logic around the profiles and getting feedback in those PRs so that it's not just a manual process. I know we have 5 minutes left. And I don't want to go through these fully on these last 2 points if possible, but I just wanted to put them out there for review. This is some of our work on the KK gate. There's been some interest in that over time, so that if there's any changes to our OpenAPI spec, this is a job that would trigger and identifying the list of new or removed endpoints and waiting for the conformance job to finish so we can see those lists of hit and conformant endpoints so that we can note a increase or decrease in endpoints. And if there's a decrease in it, being sure to comment on the PR and possibly add a label to not do that. This document, I can also drop it in the Kate's, the Kate's conformance Slack channel for review. Any questions over that before I go to our next spot? Okay, and the last part is just some update issues. I'm not going to go through them. I'm just going to open this one link and drop it in here. This is our list of Q3 enhancements on that card. Pardon my dropping the link, but it's color improvements, legend updates, stateful URL, so that we can use those as part of the landing pages. Because part of this KK gate is to have a landing page. So here's the steps you need to follow. That's just a quick feedback at the end. Anything else anybody wants to cover for our last 4 minutes?
I don't know. I just wanted to say thanks for all the coverage you put into 119. Now that we're past the test freeze date for it, I don't know if you've shared the graph and the coverage y'all have done lately.
Let's take a look. It's good. This is the conformance progress page.
Yeah.
And this green stuff here, you can see when we started the conformance project, we got 41 endpoints that had not been covered before. And we also had 11 new endpoints that came with conformance coverage. So this 2 colors here is the important stuff. The green stuff is stuff we've done before. So all of these were old endpoints that were covered. So this is the color we're looking for. Since 115, this is around the time when we started writing tests. I was writing tests. We have 7 initially for that release. What was that one? That's 13. I'll make this bigger since we're sharing the screen. There's 13. We actually had 27 in 117. We didn't realize that until we went through and updated our the metadata. Thanks for updating that, Stephen. We had 10 in 118, and this has been our biggest release. 39 endpoints, because there's an endpoint that's not showing up for some reason. We're tracking it down, and we had a goal of 40 for 119, by the way. So I think we're doing pretty good. Also, we have 41 endpoints that came with the releases. If you click on these links, we now have the ability to list those endpoints. You can see this is all going to have 119 and 119 as promoted with test. If I click on this area, these are old endpoints. You can see we've got endpoints that have not been tested since prior to 1.5. I didn't go back any further than that. But this is where those 38 endpoints come from. We still have this 177 untested, so pick one of these. And I think, we have a link for all of our the unavailable endpoints, and I'll share that. There should be a UI somewhere shortly where we say these are the endpoints we will no longer, that are not eligible for conformance, and that will reduce this number up here from 440, well, whatever, it's not 440, it's probably around 415 right now for stable.
You made
If
great
you want to see where
progress.
yeah, it's a great
Really
job,
great
everybody.
progress. It's wonderful. Congratulations.
I'm super excited about this as well. We're not introducing new tests without endpoints very often. These little bitty 1 point here, 1 point here. That is because we capture that and we can put that gate in and make sure it never happens again.
Really
That's
nice.
where I hide my 114 release teams. I missed that.
There, what did we have? So there was 113 had 1 endpoint, and then there wasn't any activity there. But I think it's because of how we've kind of changed how we measure this over time, and that's because we learned, nearly every release more about how to grow things and what we focused on. You can tell like this 114 was where all the effort went into to kind of start that forward progress. So Aaron, don't give yourself too bad a time. You were right there, and okay, let's put this up into the right now.
Hey, look, all I care about is I got this cat t-shirt out of it. So
You did get the cat. Love the shirts, my friend. Great work, everybody. And I will give you back your time. Have a wonderful day.
all right.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Happy Tuesday.